Working as a data analyst, you're frequently required to distill large data sets into simplified charts and graphs to derive key insights. In this video, we'll use NFL wide receiver data to walk through example exercises as a data analyst.
We are going to walk through a sample job interview for a data analyst. Our data set is NFL wide receiver data from the 2022 NFL season. We have every NFL wide receiver, the team they played on, number of targets, receptions, receiving yards, and the game date. First question, build a chart to visualize target share for the Miami Dolphins. So if I go to my raw data, I will insert a pivot table. Alt NVT will put in a pivot table. I will put that on a new worksheet. I can drag the team into my filters, my player into my rows, and then the number of targets into my value section. If I click on this drop down, I can just select Miami. And just to see this, I'm just going to sort this largest to smallest. So I can see Tyreek had the most, Jalen Waddle had the second. But if I really wanted to visualize this, what I could use is a pivot chart. If I go up to pivot chart, I can insert any pivot chart I want. I think to visualize the share, a pie chart would be the preferred option. I'll hit OK, drag this up, make it a little bit bigger. And then instead of having this legend, which I find is challenging to look back and forth, what I'm actually going to do is remove the title, remove the legend, and then click on this section, go to add data labels and add data callouts. And now I have a really simple callout that will tell me the wide receiver and the percent of targets they received in a given season. If you want to do some really quick cleanup, you can insert a couple rows and then just call this target share Miami. Remove grid lines and then just make this maybe a gray and rename the sheet as target share Miami. If this were a job interview, it will make your file more professional and give you a better chance of getting the job. Question number 2, create a list of all receivers with more than 15 receptions and who caught 65% of their targets. So if I go back to our raw data set, our data is structured by individual games. So if I add another pivot table and I drag in the player into the rows, the targets into the values section, and then the number of receptions into my values section, I get a summarized table of my different receivers, the number of targets they had, and the number of receptions they had in the 2022 NFL season. If I sort this largest to smallest on targets, to make this easier on myself, I'm going to add an additional column. So let's call this receiving percentage. And I will simply divide the number of receptions by the number of targets. I'll fill this down and maybe make this a yellow to make it really obvious that this is an additional column I have added to my pivot table. And so if I want to pull in just the receivers that had more than 15 targets and whose receiving percentage was above 65%, I can add an additional column here called receivers with greater than 15 receptions and 65% completion percentage. One thing I am going to update really quickly is I'm going to add an if error to my receiving percentage to say if there's an error, give me a 0. If you can see at the bottom, I get all these divide by zeros, and I think that's going to mess up my filter formula. So I just want to say give me a 0 if there's an error and not include it. So what I want to use is the filter formula. If I use filter, my array will be the names of the wide receivers because that is what I would like to return. And then for my include, I want to use an open parentheses to select my first argument, which will be the sum of receptions. If I highlight the sum of receptions and then use a greater than 15, that will say greater than 15 receptions are the only receivers I want to include. And then if I want to have multiple arguments in my filter formula, I can use an asterisk or shift 8 will pull up the asterisk or multiplication symbol and then another open parentheses, and then I can select my second criteria array. So my receiving percentage. I'll select that percentage and then use greater than 65%. I can close that and then hit enter. And now what you see is I have the 51 receivers who had more than 15 receptions and who completed more than 65% of their targets. Justin Jefferson is in my list, Tyreek's in my list, CeeDee Lamb's in my list, Devontae Adams did not make it as he only completed 56% of his targets. Probably missing Aaron Rodgers at this point. If I want to clean this up really quickly, I can insert a couple rows. I'm just going to go back and I'm actually just going to copy this header because I'm lazy and I want to save my time. And we can just call this top wide receivers. So question 3, create a combination chart for yards and touchdowns for all wide receivers on the Kansas City Chiefs. So if I go back to my raw data, I can insert another pivot table. And what I will do is drag my team into my filters. I will drag my player into my rows, and then I will drag receiving yards into my values and receiving touchdowns into my values. If I go back up to my team, I can filter on Kansas City. I can sort this largest to smallest and now add another pivot table chart. So pivot table analyze, pivot chart. And then if we want a combination chart, we can go to combo and decide what we want. So do we want a clustered column? Do we want a line chart? Do we want an area chart? I think the clustered column chart looks good for receiving yards, and I like the line for receiving touchdowns, but what we might want to do is add receiving touchdowns on a separate axis. So if I click this button, it will put it on a secondary axis. If I hit OK, I can make this chart a little bit bigger, and what we can see is the columns represent the sum of their receiving yards, where the line represents the number of touchdowns they scored. This chart obviously would benefit if we included tight ends, but this data set only focuses on wide receivers. Quick bonus tip here is the great part about pivot charts is we can toggle through our data really easily. So if I wanted to come up here and maybe look at Baltimore, I could hit OK, and I could see the data for the Baltimore wide receivers. I could see the data for the Dallas wide receivers, and really easily understand for each team which receiver had the most receiving yards and how did that correlate with their receiving touchdowns. Let's go back to our question list and go over question 4. Which wide receiver with more than 15 receptions had the greatest yards per completion? So the way I'm going to accomplish this is by appending an additional column to my raw data set. I will call this receptions include. And now what I can do is write a really simple if statement to understand whether or not each receiver should be included in our data set. So if I write if, and what I want to pull in is I want to pull in the total number of receptions this receiver had in a year. If I write X lookup, my lookup value will be the wide receiver name. My lookup array will be on our aggregated sheet. I will highlight all of the wide receivers, F4 to lock that in place, and then highlight my receptions as my return array. F4, I'll simply say if not found, return 0, close my X lookup, and then say greater than 15. And what I want to do is I want to include them. And if it's not true, I want to leave that blank. So double quotation marks. Now if I add another pivot table, I have this really handy filter. And I can just drag receiver include into my filter. I can drag my player into my rows. I can drag my receiving yards into my values. And I can drag my receptions into my values. So what we'll need to do is go up here to receiving include, just select include. And now what I can see, if I sort my number of receptions, largest to smallest, I can see I only have receivers with 16 receptions or more. If I want to find the number of yards per receptions, I can divide the number of yards by the number of receptions, and this is just giving me the average yards per reception for each one of my receivers. This is one way to do it, but just to show you a different option, I'm going to talk about how to use a calculated field. So if I go to pivot table, analyze, fields, items, and sets, calculated field, I'll insert a new field called yards per reception. And my formula will simply be receiving yards, which I can double click, divided by receptions. If I hit add and OK, Excel will add this field to my pivot table. And what's the great part about it is I can actually just filter on this field. And I can search largest to smallest and see Sammy Watkins only had 16 receptions, but certainly were worth a lot. And I can go to the bottom and I can say Brandon Powell had a lot of checkdowns, same as Scotty Miller. And so if you just copy the top, you have the highest, which is Sammy Watkins, and then you have the least, which is Brandon Powell. So you've completed all of the different questions in this job interview. If this were an actual job interview, it would behoove you to clean up this data set to create a professional looking model. So you have your raw data, you have a raw data separator that identifies where it is. And what I'll actually just do is copy this raw data separator to right after my question list and just call this answers. And then I'll rename each one of these tabs. So for my target share, I'll just say Q1. For my top wide receiver, I'll say Q2. My sheet 3, which I didn't rename, I will call Q3 Kansas City receivers. And then for my sheet 4, I'll call this Q4 yards per reception. So that way it's really, really easy for whoever's evaluating your interview to be able to go through it. I would put them in order. If you want to really go above and beyond, what you could do is you could color code these in a descending list of darkness, which I always think looks nice. So if you want to make your first answer this darkest shade of gray, make this second one the second darkest, make this third one the middle, and then this last one the even lighter shade of green. What you have is this really nice descending list of colors, which only really takes a few seconds to do, and I find looks really nice. And if you want to add a title, insert a row, and then you can just copy these titles just to make it a little bit easier on yourself, right? This is Kansas City receivers. And then this is yards per reception. Turn off grid lines for these. And one last thing is I just color this column we created yellow to make it obvious this is a calculated field. But now if you flip through your file, it's really clear what you've done, what the sheets are, and makes it really, really easy for anyone evaluating your interview to pass you, right? Which is the goal of going through this exercise, is that you want to pass this test so you can get the job. And if you gave this as an answer, I can guarantee you, you will pass this job interview every single time.